The first time the HOA president stepped onto my property, she called 911 before I had even unpacked a single box. She believed she could intimidate anyone, boss around the neighborhood, and enforce rules that didn't even exist. She had no idea that by the end of this week she would be paying me rent for her own house. The neighbors whispered about her, about the fines, about her sudden inspections, but no one dared stand up. She thought she held all the power. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. Smash that like and subscribe button if you have ever had an overbearing HOA, because this story is about to get insane. I had imagined this day for months. Pulling into my new lake house, I could finally feel the weight of the city. The endless meetings, the deadlines, and the loneliness slipping away. The air smelled of pine and fresh water. The lake glimmered under the late afternoon sun. And for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe that I was home. I had come here for peace, for quiet, for a life that felt normal again. Then she appeared. Vanessa Harper, the HOA president, marching across my driveway as if she owned the place. Neon visor perched on her head, clipboard clutched in one hand, phone pressed to her ear. She moved with the kind of certainty that comes from years of unchallenged authority. I didn't know her yet, but I could already tell she thrived on fear and overreaction. She started shouting, pointing at my truck, claiming I was trespassing, claiming the house belonged to the HOA. Before I could even react, she had called 911. I leaned against my truck, calm, letting her act out. People like her are predictable. They feed on panic, on the expectation that you will fight back. I didn't. I simply observed, quietly noting every movement, every word, every little twitch of arrogance. When the police arrived, the tension shifted slightly. I handed over the deed. The officer glanced at Vanessa, sighed, and confirmed that I owned the house. Her face twitched in disbelief, her carefully constructed authority crumbling in the blink of an eye. She muttered something about a clerical error and stomped back to her car, heels slamming the pavement like she still thought she mattered. I watched her go, feeling the calm confidence that comes from knowing the rules while she only pretended to. Later that evening, I found my first fine taped to the front door. $250 for unauthorized construction materials visible from the street, referring to the moving boxes I had stacked neatly on the driveway. I sat on the porch, looking at the lake turning golden in the fading sunlight, and allowed myself a small smile. She thought she had found a target who would bend, a victim to intimidate. She had no idea the quiet man she had challenged was armed with knowledge, patience, and a plan that had been months in the making. For the last 6 months, I had quietly purchased 14 properties in the neighborhood, each through a carefully crafted LLC or trust. One of them, unknown to her, was her own house. Every bylaw, every loophole, every minor rule had been studied and cataloged. Knowledge and preparation were my weapons. Anger, yelling, and emotional outbursts were hers. That distinction mattered more than she could ever realize. I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I didn't even respond to the fine immediately. I waited. She would push again, and when she did, she would finally see the consequences of her arrogance. By the time she realized what had happened, it would be too late. Her small kingdom built on fear was about to collapse. As night fell and the stars reflected in the lake, I felt calm satisfaction. This was the first move in a game that Vanessa Harper didn't even know she was playing. She had no idea that her empire of intimidation had a hidden landlord, a patient strategist, and a community on the brink of liberation. The next morning, I woke to another fine taped to my front door. This one was even more absurd. $50 for a mailbox that supposedly didn't match the HOA guidelines. I had carefully chosen the mailbox weeks before, and according to the official rules, it was perfectly legal. Vanessa Harper didn't care about legality. She cared about control. She cared about fear. And she clearly believed that if she kept attacking me, eventually I would fold. I walked to the driveway, coffee in hand, watching the lake shimmer under the early sun. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze as if mocking me. I made a note of it, photographed it, and placed it neatly in a folder labeled Vanessa Harper Fines. I had a feeling this collection would become very useful later. By mid-morning, the next round arrived. A $200 fine for unauthorized landscaping. Apparently, the small potted plants I had set near the porch were a threat to the harmony of the community. I laughed quietly. Vanessa didn't realize that while she was obsessing over pots and mailboxes, I had been quietly building leverage. I decided to visit Dan Porter, a longtime neighbor who had lived here for decades. He had seen Vanessa at her worst, witnessed the way she manipulated the HOA board, how she intimidated retirees, and how she financially benefited from the community she claimed to serve. We sat on his porch, lake glimmering in the distance, and he told me stories of fines, threats, and harassment that he had endured silently for years. His eyes held the same quiet anger I felt, the frustration of being powerless in the face of someone who abused authority for personal gain. I listened and took notes. Everything he told me added another piece to the puzzle. Vanessa Harper was not just petty. She was systematic, calculating, and dangerously unchecked. Her arrogance was her weakness, and I intended to exploit it. I told Dan that patience was key, that reacting emotionally was exactly what she wanted. The quieter we stayed, the stronger our position would become. He nodded slowly, understanding that the rules of engagement were about to change. Returning home, I went through the HOA bylaws with a fine-tooth comb. Every loophole, every discrepancy, every missing signature became part of my strategy. I knew her power was built on fear and ignorance. My power was built on knowledge, patience, and ownership. I held the cards, but I wasn't going to reveal them yet. Vanessa would continue to escalate, thinking she was winning, while the foundation of her empire was quietly being dismantled. By the afternoon, another fine arrived. $300 for something called visual dissonance from public view. I stared at the paper, slightly amused. Vanessa's creativity in generating violations was impressive in a terrifying way. The audience watching this story might be thinking that she was unstoppable. But here's the secret. She wasn't. Every fine, every call to the police, every intimidation tactic only made my eventual reveal sweeter. I organized every paper, every photo, every email, knowing that the time would come when this evidence would topple her like a house of cards. She believed she was untouchable. The neighbors believed they were helpless. And I watched and waited, quietly smiling. If you have ever had an HOA or neighbor overstep like this, hit that like button and drop your state in the comments. You are about to see exactly what happens when patience and strategy meet unchecked tyranny. By the end of the week, Vanessa Harper would escalate once more. She would schedule a board meeting, summon neighbors, and attempt to humiliate me publicly. She had no idea that everything she thought was her power was about to become her undoing. And that was when the game would truly begin. By the third day, Vanessa Harper's campaign of fines and threats was escalating faster than I expected. Mailboxes, plants, moving boxes, nothing escaped her attention. Every note taped to my door felt like a challenge, a small spark meant to ignite fear. But I stayed calm. I knew the power she wielded was only an illusion. Knowledge and patience were my allies. She didn't know I had been quietly researching every property in the neighborhood, every loophole in the HOA rules, and every detail about her own house. I decided to reach out to more neighbors. Fear had silenced most of them, but whispers travel fast in small communities. Dan Porter had already opened a door, and through him I met several others who had endured Vanessa's petty tyranny for years. They spoke softly, hesitant to be overheard. Stories poured out, fines for minor paint colors, for small decorations, for children playing outside at the wrong hour. One neighbor had been threatened with foreclosure for a trivial landscaping violation. Another had been forced to repaint a porch because Vanessa didn't like the color choice. Their stories painted a picture of someone who used rules as weapons and fear as leverage. Vanessa Harper wasn't just a bully. She was a strategist. Someone who had turned her HOA position into a small kingdom built on intimidation and exploitation. But in each story, there was a hint of her weakness, arrogance. Every neighbor who obeyed out of fear only reinforced her delusion that she was untouchable. That arrogance was my leverage. I spent the afternoon walking the streets, meeting quietly with neighbors who trusted me enough to speak. I documented every story, every claim, every informal complaint. Everything would matter, Every neighbor I spoke with added pieces to the puzzle. The more I learned, the more I realized how much power I already had. Vanessa thought she was building a fortress. In reality, she had built a house of cards waiting for a quiet wind to topple it. Back at my house, I pulled out the property records again. 14 homes quietly owned under LLCs and trusts, including Vanessa Harper's. She had no idea. Not only would she be paying her own fines eventually, but she would also be paying me rent. My mind replayed the moments of confrontation in the driveway, the absurd fines, the phone calls to the police. The tension of these past days had been orchestrated carefully, leading to a moment where her empire of fear would unravel publicly and irreversibly. I paused and looked at the lake. Calm water reflected the rising sun, but beneath the surface, currents ran strong and unseen. That's how I envisioned my plan, invisible yet unstoppable. She didn't see the strategy forming around her because she assumed she controlled the narrative. And that overconfidence was her fatal flaw. By evening, whispers had begun to travel further. A neighbor called me with a story about Vanessa threatening to fine someone for having a small inflatable pool. Another mentioned she tried to block a delivery because the box landed slightly off the driveway line. Each story confirmed one truth. The neighborhood was fed up. And once they realized I had the power she could not touch, they would rally. If you have ever had a petty tyrant in your life, hit that like button and comment your strategy below. Imagine the satisfaction of seeing someone like that finally held accountable. That's exactly what was about to unfold here. As the sun dipped below the lake, I knew the next move would come from her. She would escalate. She would demand attention, force confrontations, and try to humiliate me. But by the time she did, her actions would set the stage for her own downfall. The cracks in her kingdom were forming, and when they widened, there would be no hiding for Vanessa Harper. The next morning, I found a thick envelope taped to my front door. The HOA letterhead immediately caught my eye. Vanessa Harper had escalated from petty fines to full-blown legal threats. She was suing me. At least that was her claim. Reading the letter carefully, it was a mixture of vague violations, imagined infractions, and over-the-top demands. She demanded that I remove plants, repaint the porch, and pay fines totaling over $1,500 within 10 days. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and exhaled slowly. Most people would panic at this stage. Most people would pay to avoid conflict. I did neither. I had already anticipated this move. Every claim she made, every demand would be documented. Every overreach would serve as evidence of her corruption. She thought she could bully me into compliance. What she didn't realize was that she had already lost the leverage she believed she held. I brewed coffee and took a seat by the window, looking out over the lake. The water shimmered quietly, completely indifferent to the petty power struggles happening on its banks. That calm surface reflected exactly how I wanted to move. Quiet, patient, methodical. I went through the envelope piece by piece, highlighting contradictions, impossible deadlines, and references to bylaws that didn't exist. Every error was a nail in the coffin of her credibility. By mid-morning, Vanessa had begun her next tactic. She started knocking on doors, rallying neighbors, telling them I was in violation of the HOA rules. Some neighbors looked anxious, some hesitant, and a few rolled their eyes with silent frustration. I had been speaking to the same neighbors over the past few days. Their whispers of fear were slowly turning into curiosity and quiet excitement. The realization that I had a secret, a plan, a way to fight back, began to spread. I sat down with Dan Porter again. We reviewed the legal letter together. He was astonished by the sheer audacity of Vanessa's claims. She was escalating too quickly, overestimating her control, underestimating patience, and failing to see the larger picture. The mistakes in the letter were glaring. She had left herself open. Every misstep, every overreach, every attempt to intimidate me would eventually be laid bare in front of the community. I began organizing everything I had collected. Photos of fines, HOA correspondence, neighbors' stories, property records, and proof of ownership of multiple homes, including hers. Each document was another piece of the puzzle. Vanessa thought she was building a case, but in reality, She was constructing the framework for her own undoing. By afternoon, she had scheduled a community meeting to try to publicly humiliate me. Flyers were posted, emails sent, and a few curious neighbors started showing up to witness the drama. She was confident, smug, and utterly unaware that the meeting would mark the beginning of her downfall. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the lake. Calm on the surface, powerful beneath, patient. That would be me in the coming days. Each threat, each fine, each intimidating tactic would be met with quiet preparation. She would escalate, thinking she was winning, while the foundation for her defeat was quietly being built. If you have ever had someone try to intimidate you with legal threats, hit that like button and comment your strategy below. Imagine the satisfaction when someone who abuses their position finally faces the consequences. That's exactly what was about to unfold here. As the sun began to set, I knew Vanessa Harper would take the next step tomorrow. She would come armed with lawyers, her clipboard, and a sense of unstoppable authority. But every move she made would lead her closer to humiliation and exposure. The legal threat was only the beginning, and when the board meeting arrived, she would discover that all her power was nothing compared to patience, strategy, and quiet ownership. The moment Vanessa Harper scheduled the community meeting, I knew it was time to shift from defense to preparation. Her arrogance was her weakness. She believed that intimidation alone could bend anyone to her will. She did not realize that every step she had taken over the past few days had been tracked, documented, and analyzed. Every fine, every phone call to the police, every threat she made had only strengthened my position. I spent the morning reviewing property records again. 14 homes in the neighborhood were quietly under my control, each purchased through a series of LLCs and trusts to remain invisible. One of those homes belonged to Vanessa Harper. Not a guess, not a bluff, fully documented and legally binding. The power she thought she wielded was, in reality, mine. She had unknowingly been walking onto land I owned for months. I made notes, highlighting deadlines, bylaws she had misinterpreted, and discrepancies in her claims. I created a timeline of her harassment and linked it to HOA violations she had falsified. Every document was a thread, every thread woven into a web that would eventually ensnare her completely. The more I worked, the more I realized how much leverage I held. By midday, I started drafting the first stage of the reveal. It would be subtle. She had to think she was in control until the moment she realized she was not. A public disclosure at the HOA meeting would show her overreach, her corruption, and finally, the truth that she had been unknowingly paying rent to me for her own house. Every neighbor would witness it. Every member of the HOA would see that her kingdom was built on fear, not law, and that it could crumble in an instant. I also reached out quietly to a trusted investigator. Every financial record she had manipulated, every embezzled HOA fee, every irregularity in her bookkeeping would be verified and documented. The audit needed to be perfect. It had to leave no doubt, no loophole, no excuse. When the time came, she would be exposed fully, publicly, and irrevocably. The neighbors I had spoken with began to act as allies without even knowing it. Small comments, subtle questions, quiet doubts. Their whispers were seeds of rebellion. Vanessa Harper did not realize that the community she ruled with fear was slowly awakening. Each fine she had issued, each overreaction, had only added fuel to the anticipation of her downfall. By late afternoon, I organized a plan for every interaction she might try at the upcoming meeting. She would try to intimidate, to shame, to rally support against me. I would respond calmly, systematically, legally, and publicly. Every misstep she made would be highlighted, every overreach recorded. The audience, neighbors, board members, anyone watching, would see her unravel before their eyes. If you have ever had a neighbor or authority figure push too far, hit that like button and drop your strategy in the comments. Imagine knowing the secret advantage while the villain believes they are in control. That is the kind of satisfaction that makes moments like this unforgettable. As evening fell over the lake, I looked out across the water and smiled. Vanessa Harper thought she was invincible. She believed that fear and threats were enough to maintain her control. She had no idea that her empire rested on paper, not power. The time was near. Every meeting, every fine, every threat would soon serve as evidence of her overreach. Tomorrow, the first cracks would become visible. She would attempt to dominate, to shame, and to intimidate in front of the neighbors. She would not see the web of strategy she had walked into. By the time she realized what was happening, the HOA president would be nothing more than a tenant, paying rent to the very person she thought she was trying to control. The morning arrived with an air of quiet tension. Vanessa Harper was preparing for another round of intimidation, completely unaware that her own actions were leading her into a trap. I sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the files my investigator had compiled. Every HOA fee she had embezzled, every irregularity in the financial records, every small detail she had overlooked was now documented, verified, and ready to be revealed. This was no longer speculation. This was proof, and it was about to become public. I went through the audit line by line, highlighting the discrepancies and tying them directly to her decisions. Each overcharge, each false violation, each attempt to extract fines illegally was now irrefutable. The pile of evidence wasn't just overwhelming. It was catastrophic. Vanessa had spent months, maybe years, building a reputation as a perfect enforcer of the rules. I was about to expose that reputation for what it really was, a mask covering corruption and abuse. The neighbors had started noticing. Small conversations in the streets, subtle glances, whispered questions. People who had been silenced by fear were now curious. They didn't know the full story yet, but they sensed change in the air. Their whispers were enough to fuel Vanessa's paranoia, and paranoia is a dangerous thing in the hands of someone who already thought she was untouchable. By late morning, I organized the audit into a sequence that would make the most impact. Charts, records, photos, emails, and receipts were all in order. I mapped out the narrative carefully. First, show her overreach. Second, show the financial discrepancies. Third, reveal her house was under my control. Finally, let the evidence speak for itself. Every moment was choreographed to maximize her shock and the audience's satisfaction. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that patience was critical. She would make a move tomorrow. She would try to humiliate me publicly at the HOA meeting, confident that the power she wielded would protect her. What she didn't know was that every document, every financial record, and every LLC was a silent weapon, waiting to strike. If you've ever been bullied by someone with petty authority, hit that like button and comment your strategy below. Imagine the feeling of watching someone who has abused their power finally get exposed. That feeling is coming for Vanessa Harper, and it is coming soon. By afternoon, I arranged a quick meeting with Dan Porter and a few trusted neighbors. They didn't need to know every detail, but I needed allies who could witness the audit and validate the narrative when it went public. Their reactions were priceless. Some were shocked, some were skeptical, some were quietly thrilled. I smiled inwardly. Their support, subtle as it was, would amplify the impact when the audit was revealed to the entire HOA. Evening fell, and Vanessa Harper remained oblivious. She called a few neighbors, threatened fines, and double-checked her meeting notes, fully confident that she was in control. Meanwhile, I looked at the lake through the sliding glass door, its calm surface reflecting the final rays of sunlight. Calm on the outside, powerful beneath the surface. That was my approach, and by tomorrow, she would see just how unstoppable preparation and strategy could be. Tomorrow, the HOA meeting would begin. Vanessa would arrive with all her confidence and arrogance. She would not realize that she was about to walk into a room where her every action could be countered with evidence, where the community would finally witness the truth, and where her empire of fear would begin to crumble. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Vanessa Harper strutted into the community hall as if she owned every inch of the room, clipboard in hand, ready to intimidate anyone who dared question her. Chairs were lined in perfect rows, neighbors shuffled quietly, some nervous, some curious, all aware that something was about to happen. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and tension. Vanessa began immediately, launching into a lecture about fines, violations, and supposed infractions. Her voice carried authority, but there was a tremor beneath the confidence. I watched quietly from the back of the room, calmly holding my folder of evidence. Every chart, every photo, every irregularity in the HOA's finances had been laid out and ordered for maximum impact. Neighbors whispered nervously among themselves, unsure of what to believe. Vanessa tried to rally them, insisting that I was the problem, that I had broken rules, that she was protecting the neighborhood. She didn't see the subtle exchange of glances, the hesitant nods, the quiet curiosity spreading. Doubt had begun to creep in. I stood slowly, walking to the front with my folder in hand. The room grew silent, every eye turning toward me. Vanessa's face remained fixed in a mask of control, but I could see the first cracks. Her confidence wavered when she noticed the neighbors leaning slightly closer, the phones recording every movement, the whispers turning into questions. I began by addressing the fines. Each one, absurd and fabricated, was countered with documented proof of legality. Photos showing the harmless state of my property, and the exact bylaws she had misinterpreted. The more she tried to interject, the clearer it became to everyone in the room that her authority was fragile, her claims baseless. She sputtered, red-faced, trying to maintain control. Then I moved to the financial records. The forensic audit I had commissioned was laid out in detail. Every dollar Vanessa had misappropriated, every false charge, every manipulated fee was now visible. Charts, receipts, and spreadsheets were projected for all to see. The room was silent, disbelief on their faces, shock creeping over Vanessa's carefully maintained composure. If you've ever wanted to see someone get publicly exposed for abusing power, hit that like button and drop your state in the comments. You are about to witness it in action. Finally, the subtle reveal. I calmly mentioned that Vanessa's own home was included in the properties I had acquired. Slowly, the realization dawned. Her eyes widened. The clipboard slipped from her hands. She tried to protest, tried to argue, but the room had already absorbed the truth. Whispers erupted. The neighbors, once paralyzed by fear, were now murmuring in disbelief. She was paying rent to the very person she had tried to bully and intimidate for months. Vanessa's arrogance was gone. The mask of authority cracked, her confidence evaporating under the weight of evidence and public scrutiny. Every move she had made, every fine issued, every phone call to threaten neighbors had led directly to this moment. The HOA president, feared by the community, was reduced to scrambling for explanations while the neighbors finally saw the truth. By the end of the meeting, she was pale, humiliated, and rattled. I returned to my chair, calm as ever, letting the room absorb the shock. The first stage of justice was complete, but the story was far from over. The audit, the fines, the subtle manipulations, they were all pieces of a larger plan that would continue to dismantle her control. The day after the HOA meeting felt strangely quiet. The community was buzzing in whispers, the neighbors exchanging glances as they processed what had happened. Vanessa Harper had retreated to her house, her confidence shattered, her authority crumbling. But the storm was far from over. I knew better than to underestimate her. People like her always strike back when they feel cornered. The calm was just a pause, a deceptive lull before the next wave of chaos. I spent the morning reviewing the events of the previous day, going through every reaction, every whisper, every expression. The neighbors were slowly starting to realize that she had not been the invincible force they feared. Their whispered admiration and quiet excitement were subtle, but unmistakable. That realization alone was powerful. Fear had been replaced with curiosity, and curiosity is the first spark of rebellion. Vanessa Harper, of course, had no idea. She spent hours pacing her living room, calling her lawyer repeatedly, trying to figure out how to salvage the image she had so meticulously constructed. I knew she was panicking because she didn't yet understand that panic is visible, and visible panic weakens authority faster than any argument. The neighbors would notice it, and they did. I decided to take advantage of the pause. I walked along the lake, letting the water calm my mind while I mentally rehearsed the next steps. Every fine, every threat, every legal maneuver she had attempted had been catalogued. Every document, every photo, every whisper from neighbors was prepared for the next stage. The plan was unfolding exactly as I had anticipated. If you've ever faced someone who tried to control an entire neighborhood, hit that like button and drop your strategy in the comments. You know the feeling when a bully finally faces resistance. That feeling is about to multiply. By midday, I met with a few neighbors I trusted. They were curious, cautious, and still somewhat fearful, but the tide was turning. I shared hints of the larger plan without revealing everything. The reaction was electric. Eyes widened, jaws dropped slightly, and the energy shifted. The quiet rebellion was gaining momentum. They didn't know the full scope, but they could feel that the ground beneath Vanessa Harper's feet was unstable. Meanwhile, Vanessa made her next move. Emails, phone calls, and personal visits were used to try to regain control. She threatened fines, tried to intimidate individuals, and even suggested another HOA meeting. But each attempt was weaker than the last. Confidence is infectious, and the community's quiet curiosity was beginning to overshadow her threats. Her timing was off, her strategy reactive rather than proactive, and she had no idea that every move she made was being documented for the perfect reveal. As evening fell, I sat on my porch overlooking the lake. Calm, reflective, patient. The sun glimmered on the water, the perfect contrast to the chaos brewing in Vanessa's mind. Every move I had made was deliberate. Every moment of calm was a tool to heighten the eventual storm that would bring her empire crashing down. The calm was deceptive, yes, but it also gave the audience time to breathe, to anticipate what was coming next. And what was coming next was going to be explosive. Vanessa Harper thought she could rebuild her authority, but she had already stepped into a trap she could not escape. Tomorrow, she would make her boldest move yet, pushing the limits of intimidation. But she would do so under the watchful eye of the community, with her mistakes documented, and with a landlord she had never imagined standing calmly against her. The storm was coming, and she would have nowhere to hide. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a low hum of anticipation. Vanessa Harper had been pushing harder every day, sending emails, threatening fines, and trying to intimidate neighbors who had begun to whisper among themselves. I could sense the shift. Fear was giving way to curiosity, curiosity to realization. The moment had come to escalate the game. I walked into the HOA office, carrying only a folder. I didn't need to shout or argue. The power wasn't in my voice. It was in the truth I held, the documents I had collected, and the secret I had kept hidden until the perfect moment. Vanessa was there, of course, clipboard clutched tight, ready to assert authority as she always did. But this time, the room was subtly different. The neighbors were watching with a quiet tension, leaning forward, waiting to see what would happen next. I started by addressing the petty fines, the endless harassment, and the overreaches that had defined her reign. Each claim she had made was dismantled methodically. Every photograph, every document, every loophole in the HOA bylaws was laid out in plain view. She tried to interrupt, tried to regain control, but the room had already begun to see the cracks in her armor. Confidence faltered. Authority wavered. Then I let the bombshell drop. Calmly, methodically, I mentioned that I owned multiple properties in the neighborhood. The room shifted. Eyes widened. Whispers began. I didn't rush the reveal. I let it sink in. Each neighbor began to realize that the small tyrant who had haunted them for months had unknowingly been under my control. Finally, I revealed the centerpiece of the plan. Vanessa Harper's own house. The papers were presented with perfect clarity. She froze, her mouth opening and closing, the clipboard slipping from her fingers. The neighbors leaned in, shock replacing fear. She had been paying rent, without knowing it, to the person she had been trying to intimidate. Every threat she had made, every fine she had issued, had been aimed at someone who legally owned her property. The room was electric. Murmurs turned to exclamations. Phones were raised. Faces turned from disbelief to incredulous laughter. Vanessa's face drained of color. She attempted to speak, to argue, to assert herself, but the evidence was irrefutable. Her power had evaporated in an instant, replaced by the collective realization that her reign of fear was over. If you've ever been trapped under someone else's tyranny, hit that like button and comment your state below. Imagine seeing a bully exposed in front of an entire community. That is the exact feeling playing out in this room, and it is intoxicating. Vanessa tried to rally a few supporters, but they hesitated. The audit, the property records, the sheer audacity of the reveal had stripped her authority completely. She was no longer in control. The neighbors were no longer afraid. Their quiet murmurs turned into confident questions, their eyes reflecting relief, their whispers validating the truth that had long been suppressed. As I stepped back, letting the moment settle, I could see the panic rising. Vanessa Harper had miscalculated everything. Her empire, built on intimidation and small tyrannies, had crumbled because she underestimated patience, strategy, and the quiet power of preparation. By nightfall, she had retreated to her house, humiliated, unsure of what to do next. But this was only the beginning. The audit, the fines, and now the property reveal had set the stage for the next phase: legal exposure, public scrutiny, and the complete dismantling of her control. The morning of the public audit arrived like a storm on the lake. Word had spread through the neighborhood. Curiosity was high. Fear had turned into anticipation. Vanessa Harper arrived early, clipboard in hand, dressed in her usual armor of authority, but there was a noticeable tension in her step. She didn't know the full scope of what was coming. She never did. I entered the room calmly, folder in hand, carrying the audit my investigator had prepared. Every fraudulent fine, every manipulated fee, every irregularity in HOA finances was documented. Every misstep Vanessa had made over months of harassment was visible, organized, and undeniable. The neighbors began arriving, some hesitant, some excited. Their eyes flicked between Vanessa and me, trying to anticipate the conflict. Vanessa began her usual spiel, lecturing, threatening fines, asserting authority. But the moment I projected the first page of the audit, the room shifted. Charts, tables, and receipts displayed in plain sight confirmed the suspicions the neighbors had long harbored. The numbers told a story she could not argue with. The overcharges, the embezzled funds, the irregular payments. It was all there, neatly organized and impossible to dispute. If you've ever wanted to see someone caught in the act of corruption, hit that like button and comment your strategy below. Watch closely because this is how the tables turn. Vanessa's face began to pale. Her confident posture faltered as she realized the neighbors were seeing what I had promised. Each chart, each highlighted discrepancy, was a blow to her carefully constructed authority. She tried to speak, to redirect attention, but every word she uttered seemed weaker, more desperate. The room wasn't listening to her anymore. They were watching the truth unfold. I walked through the audit methodically, explaining the scope of her overreach. Every fine she had issued without justification, every threat of legal action without standing, every dollar funneled through the HOA under false pretenses. The evidence was irrefutable. The neighbors were murmuring, their fear replaced with disbelief and growing satisfaction. Some shook their heads in relief. Others whispered about the audacity of it all. Then came the final reveal. I calmly mentioned that she had been paying rent to me for her own home all along. The room went silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into murmurs, questions, and disbelief. Phones came out, whispers turned into excited chatter, and Vanessa Harper's carefully cultivated aura of control shattered completely. Her clipboard slipped from her hands. The mask of authority had been torn away. Her attempts to regain composure were futile. She stammered, shouted, and tried to assert herself, but every neighbor now saw the truth. Her empire of fear, fines, and threats was gone. What remained was a woman exposed for abusing power, humiliated in front of the very community she had tried to dominate. By the end of the meeting, the audit had done more than just reveal her corruption. It empowered the neighbors. They began discussing how to reclaim their community, asking questions, suggesting actions, realizing that the tyranny they had endured was finally over. Vanessa retreated, pale and defeated, understanding for the first time that her overconfidence and arrogance had led to public exposure. The stage was now set for the final act. Her personal humiliation had occurred, the community was aware, and the legal implications were becoming unavoidable. What remained was the last step, ensuring she faced consequences beyond embarrassment and fear. The days following the audit were electric. Vanessa Harper had retreated to her home, her authority crumbling in private as much as it had in public. The neighbors were buzzing with anticipation, talking quietly but confidently. Fear had been replaced by curiosity, then disbelief, and finally a sense of empowerment. Vanessa had overplayed her hand, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Legal notices began arriving. Her actions had left a trail of evidence too obvious to ignore. Every fine she had issued improperly, every false claim she had made, every financial irregularity. It was now part of an irrefutable record. The HOA board had no choice but to acknowledge the audit, and several neighbors were already consulting lawyers. The momentum was building, and Vanessa Harper had no defense. I observed quietly from my porch, the lake glimmering under the late afternoon sun. Calm on the surface, deliberate beneath, watching everything unfold exactly as planned. I didn't need to rush. Each moment of delay, each opportunity for her panic to grow, only increased the impact. She was unraveling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. By midweek, word had spread further. Vanessa Harper's reputation was collapsing. Friends and allies within the HOA were distancing themselves. Emails went unanswered. Calls were avoided. Every interaction she attempted only reminded people of her arrogance, greed, and incompetence. The dominoes were falling, one by one, and she was at the center of a storm she could not control. If you've ever faced a bully abusing authority, hit that like button and comment your strategy below. Imagine the satisfaction of watching someone's empire crumble from the inside out. That is exactly what is happening here. Then came the final confirmation. The legal audit revealed that she owed restitution for the misappropriated funds, fines collected unlawfully, and various other violations. Her house, long thought untouchable, was now under official scrutiny. Notices were served, lawyers involved, and her carefully constructed kingdom of fear had nothing left to protect her. The humiliation was complete. The neighbors began to openly celebrate small victories. Petty restrictions were lifted, previously threatened fines voided, and community meetings became spaces of discussion rather than intimidation. For the first time in years, the HOA felt like a community rather than a dictatorship. Vanessa Harper, once the untouchable queen of the neighborhood, had become a cautionary tale whispered from porch to porch. Even in her retreat, she was forced to face reality. Paying restitution, complying with the legal audit, and acknowledging her misconduct left her powerless. Every threat she had made, every fine, every intimidation tactic all backfired. Her reign had ended not with a single dramatic confrontation, but through careful preparation, patient strategy, and the unflinching exposure of the truth. The satisfaction in the room in the neighborhood was palpable. Justice had been served in multiple dimensions: financial accountability, public humiliation, and restored community freedom. The storm had finally broken, and the lakefront was calm once more, reflecting a sense of closure and victory. The neighborhood was quiet in the early morning, but the calm was now permanent. Vanessa Harper had retreated completely. The restitution payments had begun, fines were voided, and her authority was officially stripped. The HOA was no longer a playground for petty tyranny. It had been reformed, rules rewritten, and leadership replaced by neighbors who understood fairness, transparency, and respect. The community had been liberated. Walking along the lake, I reflected on the journey. Months of careful preparation, research, and strategic planning had led to this moment. Each confrontation, each minor skirmish, each intimidation attempt by Vanessa Harper had been absorbed, analyzed, and turned into leverage. Her overconfidence, arrogance, and obsession with control had made her undoing inevitable. The lesson was clear: power abused without accountability always leads to downfall. Neighbors began stopping by, offering congratulations, sharing stories of their own liberation, and marveling at the audacity of the outcome. Petty tyrants rarely anticipate consequences, and this one had learned the hard way. Conversations turned from fear to empowerment. Children played freely outside. Mailboxes displayed whimsical decorations again. The oppressive atmosphere had been replaced by joy, relief, and a newfound sense of security. I took time to review the final documents. Vanessa's house, now paying rent to me legally and formally, was part of the restitution agreement. Beyond financial accountability, the psychological victory was immense. Every overstep, every absurd fine, every call to intimidate a neighbor had been neutralized, reversed, and transformed into a public lesson on justice. If you've ever dreamed of seeing someone face the consequences of abusing authority, hit that like button and comment your strategy below. Imagine a world where justice is methodical, patient, and absolute. This is that story. The HOA board had also begun implementing reforms. Monthly meetings became transparent, votes recorded publicly, and a committee was formed to oversee fair treatment of residents. No longer could a single individual wield disproportionate power. The community had reclaimed its voice. The neighbors were finally participating, finally confident in their ability to challenge tyranny before it took root. Vanessa Harper's personal humiliation was complete. Her reputation was shattered, her financial misconduct exposed, and her authority stripped. There was no coming back. She became a cautionary tale, whispered from porch to porch, a reminder that abuse of power leaves permanent scars, but patience, strategy, and justice can restore balance. I walked back to my lake house, the sunlight reflecting on the water, a perfect metaphor for calm after the storm. The community thrived. Trust was restored. Authority was balanced. Justice had been served not with violence or revenge, but with precision, patience, and careful planning. Every neighbor could now live free of fear, and every future bully would think twice. Looking back, the entire sequence was more than personal victory. It was a blueprint for community empowerment. Abuse of authority could no longer thrive unchecked. Transparency, patience, and strategy had leveled the playing field. The lakefront was peaceful, the HOA finally a place of fairness, and the people who had once feared Vanessa Harper were now free. As the sun set behind the trees, I smiled. The journey had been long, but the ending was perfect. Justice was not only served, it was celebrated. The lake reflected the golden light, a symbol of the freedom and victory earned through careful strategy, unwavering patience, and relentless pursuit of truth. And that's how the HOA president who thought she ruled the neighborhood with fear ended up paying rent to the very person she tried to intimidate. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about justice, strategy, and standing up to abuse of power. If you've ever dealt with someone overstepping their authority, remember, patience, preparation, and knowledge are your greatest weapons. And sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power. Smash that like button if you loved seeing justice served. Drop your state in the comments to share where you would have done the same. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story in this series. Remember, the world is full of Vanessas, but there's always a way to turn the tables. Stay smart, stay patient, and never underestimate the power of strategy.